The dry October wind cut through the circular driveway like a blade wrapped in ice, scattering dead leaves across marble steps that had never known poverty. Giovanni Calabrese stood motionless in the doorway of his mansion, his tall frame draped in a tailored Italian suit so dark it swallowed the moonlight, his scarred face hidden behind dark glasses even in the gathering darkness. His hands, the same hands that had signed death warrants across Boston, that had commanded 12 men in black to erase problems from existence, trembled as they held his daughter Emma against his chest. The 7-year-old girl's body burned with fever, her breathing shallow and rattling like wind through a broken window, and Giovanni could see nothing. Absolutely nothing. He could feel the heat radiating from her small frame. He could hear the wet, choking sounds coming from her lungs. But he could not see her face. He could not see if her eyes were still open, if she was still fighting to breathe, if she was still alive. "Doctor," Giovanni's voice dropped low, controlled, deadly. "Tell me what you see." The family physician, a nervous man named Castellano who had kept the Calabrese operation healthy for 17 years, stammered and sweated beneath the gaze of a blind man. "Pneumonia, sir. Severe. Her oxygen levels are dropping. She needs a hospital. Now. I cannot treat this here, and if we wait," he did not finish. He did not need to. Enzo and Pietro, Giovanni's closest lieutenants, stood frozen by the entrance. Armed guards lined the walls, their weapons hanging useless at their sides. In 15 years of working for Giovanni Calabrese, neither lieutenant had ever seen him like this. They had seen him furious. They had seen him methodical. But this was something different. This was a man stripped of everything except his helplessness. The front doors burst open, and a woman in a threadbare coat pushed past the guards like they were nothing. Mia Reynolds was 28 years old but looked 40. Her hands, rough and red from cleaning chemicals, reached out without hesitation or permission, and she lifted Emma from Giovanni's arms. The child weighed almost nothing, he could feel that, the terrible lightness of her, and Mia cradled her the way someone cradles something they understand, something fragile and breaking. "Where are you taking her?" Giovanni's voice cracked like a whip across marble. "St. Mary's Hospital. 3 blocks away. They have oxygen. They have real doctors." Mia did not run. She walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The guards moved aside without orders. Even they could see that something in this woman burned brighter than any weapon. The cold October air swallowed Mia as she descended the steps, Emma's rattling breath the only sound beneath the wind. Her battered Honda Civic sat in the circular driveway between 2 black SUVs worth more money than she had earned in her entire life combined. She kicked open the passenger door, laid Emma across the back seat, and turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, roared to life. Giovanni stood in the doorway, hearing only the sound of his daughter being driven away by a stranger. "Enzo," he said quietly. "Follow them. Make sure she gets there." Enzo moved without hesitation. The Honda disappeared into the Boston night, red taillights bleeding into darkness, and Giovanni Calabrese, the man who controlled every street from the harbor to the hills, the man who had survived betrayal that left him blind, the man who trusted no one, stood alone in his mansion and realized he had just given his daughter to a woman whose name he did not know. But what he did not understand yet was that this moment, this single moment of helplessness, would become the hinge upon which his entire empire would turn. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back to the beginning to understand how a woman with nothing and a man who had lost everything ended up bound together in a way that no amount of money or power could ever break. 14 days earlier. The clock in the shelter kitchen read 6:19 in the morning when Mia Reynolds counted the bills in her wallet one more time, hoping the numbers had somehow changed. They had not. $78. That was all. The crumpled bills, 2 20s, a 50, and 8 ones, sat in her palm like a death sentence written in paper and ink. Her coat hung on a peg by the door, and in the inside pocket, she already knew what waited. The foreclosure notice. 14 days. That was how long the bank had given her to produce $85,000 or lose the small house that her mother had left her, the only thing in the world that belonged to her and her two children, Marcus, who was 11, and Sophia, who was 9. $85,000. She had 78. The shelter's kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the drip of water from a faucet that management refused to fix. Mia wrapped the bills back into a rubber band and returned them to her wallet. She had work in an hour. 2 jobs, actually. First, the breakfast shift here at the Harbor Street shelter, where she volunteered without pay because her children needed to see that some things were done simply because they had to be done. Then, at noon, she would begin her real work, scrubbing floors and cleaning bathrooms at the Meridian Hotel, a luxury establishment where businessmen in $1,000 suits drank martinis and left tips that Cordelia Blackwood, the front-of-house manager, regularly stole. Mia had never confronted her about it. What was the point? Cordelia Blackwood was 46 years old, wore diamond earrings that cost more than Mia's annual salary, and had made it clear through countless small cruelties that Mia was replaceable, easily erasable, the kind of person who could vanish and leave no ripple in the world. The shelter's main room began to fill as the sun rose. 30, maybe 40 people came through the doors each morning seeking breakfast and a moment of warmth. Most of them were invisible too. Most of them had learned, as Mia had learned, that the world had forgotten they existed. But there was one child who looked even more invisible than the rest. Emma Calabrese sat in the corner of the dining room every morning without speaking, without eating much, clutching a worn prayer card in her small hands like it was the only real thing left in the world. She was 7 years old with dark hair tangled from sleeping in the shelter, and her eyes held the kind of emptiness that no child should ever carry. No family came to collect her. No one claimed her. She simply appeared one morning 2 months ago, and no one asked questions, because questions had a way of creating bureaucratic nightmares that no one wanted to navigate. Mia set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her one Tuesday morning. Emma did not look up. But her fingers loosened slightly on the prayer card. "What's that?" Mia asked, not because she expected an answer, but because the child looked so desperately alone that she could not bear the silence. Emma held it up. The card was old, worn at the edges, and printed on it was a saint, Michael, Mia thought, the one with the sword, but what caught her eye was the embroidered lining. Small letters, faded from years of handling, spelled out a name, Giovanni. Something cold moved through Mia's chest. "Did your father give you that?" she asked carefully. Emma nodded once and returned to her eggs. She did not speak. She never spoke. But her grip on the card tightened, and Mia understood that this small piece of paper held an entire history of loss. By noon, Mia was scrubbing the marble lobby of the Meridian Hotel on her hands and knees, her skin raw from chemicals, her back screaming from hours of bending. Douglas Hale, the shift manager, stood nearby counting tips from a table of investment bankers. He pocketed 3 of Mia's $5 without hesitation. She watched him do it and said nothing. She needed this job more than she needed pride. The wind outside drummed against the tall windows, and Mia thought about Emma's prayer card, about that name embroidered in fading letters. Giovanni. She thought about the 17-year-old girl she used to be, before the predator who called himself a boyfriend, before 2 pregnancies that changed her body and her life, before the men who had used her and vanished and left behind only the echo of their cruelty. She had spent so long being invisible that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The afternoon light faded into evening as she moved through the hotel's corridors with her mop and bucket, her reflection ghosting across polished marble. At 8:30 she clocked out and counted her remaining hours. 7 hours until her shift at the night cleaning service at Boston Medical Center, where she would scrub surgical suites for minimum wage and no benefits. The wind had turned bitter by the time she walked home through the darkening neighborhoods. October in Boston had teeth. The wind bit at her exposed skin and screamed through empty alleyways, and Mia pulled her coat tighter and tried not to think about the foreclosure notice waiting in her pocket, about the 14 days counting down, about the mathematical reality that she would never earn enough. Her phone buzzed at 9:53 that night while she was mopping surgical suite 4. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Is this Mia Reynolds? A man's voice, official, cold. Yes, she said. This is Dr. Harrison at Boston Medical Center Emergency Department. Your daughter Sophia was brought to us by paramedics 2 hours ago. She collapsed at school. We need you to come now. The mop fell from her hands. It clattered against tile and the water from the bucket splashed across the floor, spreading like spilled blood, and Mia ran. Sophia lay on a hospital bed in the pediatric ward with tubes running into her small arms, her breathing supported by oxygen, her lungs bright with infection on the x-rays they showed Mia. Pneumonia. The same word the shelter staff whispered about Emma, the same word that meant danger, that meant death could arrive without warning. The emergency room doctor's voice was kind but distant. Your daughter needs hospitalization. At least 3 days, probably 5. With antibiotics and oxygen support, she should recover, but without treatment. He paused. He did not need to finish. How much? Mia heard herself ask. How much will it cost? The doctor shifted uncomfortably. That depends on your insurance, but ballpark, we're looking at $8,000 to $12,000 in hospital costs alone. Plus the ER visit, the imaging. Mia stopped listening. $12,000. She had 78. The foreclosure notice demanded $85,000 in 14 days, and her daughter had just added $12,000 more to the impossible equation. She pulled a plastic chair next to Sophia's bed and sat down. Her hands, which had spent the evening scrubbing surgical instruments, reached out and held her daughter's small hand. Sophia's fingers were so thin, so fragile, like bird bones wrapped in skin. It's okay, Mama, Sophia whispered. I'm okay. Mia looked at her 9-year-old child lying in a hospital bed, her lungs struggling to pull in air, and she understood with sudden, absolute clarity that she was not going to make it. The money would never materialize. The house would be taken. Her children would end up in foster care, and she would end up like so many of the people she served at the shelter, invisible, forgotten, erased. The wind outside the hospital window screamed like something being tortured, and Mia Reynolds held her daughter's hand and thought about Emma's prayer card with the name Giovanni embroidered in fading letters, and she wondered what it meant, and she wondered if it mattered, and she wondered how much longer she could pretend that love and determination and sacrifice would somehow be enough. It was not enough. It had never been enough. 14 days. $85,000. A daughter in the hospital. Another child sleeping in a shelter. And a man somewhere in this city who held the power to destroy lives or save them, and whose name was embroidered on a worn prayer card held by a 7-year-old girl who had already lost everything. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The October wind cut through Boston like a blade wrapped in ice, and Mia Reynolds walked 3 blocks from the bus stop with her children's hands gripped tight in hers. Lily was 9, Marcus was 6, and the dead leaves skittered across the sidewalk in front of them like something fleeing. She carried 2 canvas bags of groceries in one arm, the other hand deep in her coat pocket, counting the crumpled bills for the 5th time that day. $78. That was all that remained. In her other pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had creases, sat a foreclosure notice. The words had been written in a cold, professional font that somehow made them worse: $85,000 due in 14 days, or the small 2-bedroom house her grandmother had left her would belong to the bank instead. $85,000. She repeated it in her mind the way other people repeated prayers. 85,000. The number had consumed her thoughts for 3 weeks, ever since the notice arrived in an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. She had counted everything she owned, the furniture her mother had given her, the car with 280,000 miles on the odometer, the wedding ring she could sell but kept not selling because it still felt like giving up the last piece of her old life, the life before everything broke. Lily pulled at her sleeve. Mom, can we get the chicken or the beans this week? Mia looked at her daughter. 9 years old and already doing the math that no 9-year-old should have to do. She had inherited her mother's dark eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her own mother that way decades ago, full of a worry that no child should carry. Beans, Mia said, trying to smile. We'll make that pasta you like. The kind with the garlic bread. But the smile cost her something. It cost her the last piece of the day where she could believe that lying to her children was a kindness and not a cruelty. They climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment on Wickham Street, 3rd floor, the walls the color of old teeth. Marcus's sneaker had a hole in the toe, and his sock showed through like a small, tragic flag. Mia had already patched it twice. Tonight she would patch it again. The apartment was cold. The landlord kept the heat low to save money, which meant Mia kept the oven on with the door open while she cooked, which was both dangerous and the only way she could keep the place warm enough for the children to sleep. She set the groceries on the counter. Canned beans, pasta, a box of powdered milk, a package of chicken thighs on sale, eggs, a loaf of the day-old bread that Goodwill Market put in the bins at 6 in the evening. $73 spent. $5 remaining in her pocket until the next shift at the Meridian Hotel, which was tomorrow night, which was still 17 hours away. Bath time, she said to Marcus, and he moved toward the bathroom with the obedience of a child who knew the routine. Bath time meant the water would be lukewarm because the hot water heater had been broken for 2 months and the landlord kept saying he would fix it but he wouldn't. Mia ran the water and tested it with her elbow, the old test, the test her own mother had taught her. She helped Marcus undress and watched him sink into the water, his small body covered in scars from falls and accidents, his shoulders already developing the slight curve of someone who spent most of his time trying to take up less space. She soaked his hair and he closed his eyes. "Is the house okay?" he asked, his voice so small it could barely compete with the sound of the water running. "What do you mean, baby?" "Lily said the bank man is coming to take it." Mia's hand stopped moving in his hair. She forced them to keep going. "The house is fine, Marcus. The house is ours. Don't worry about things you've heard. That's not your job." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie the way you know a wound is infected. You feel the heat of it. You know something is wrong even before you look at the damage. After Marcus was dry and in his pajamas, Lily came in for her turn. She was old enough now to bathe herself, and Mia stood in the doorway instead, watching her daughter scrub her own arms with a seriousness that broke something in her chest. At 9, Lily had already learned that survival depended on taking care of yourself. Mia hadn't taught her this. Poverty had. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the steam rising from the water. Mia's hands gripped the doorframe so hard her knuckles went white. "Yes," she said. It was the only answer she could give. If she said anything else, Lily would cry, and if Lily cried, Mia would cry, and if Mia cried, she might not be able to stop. "We're going to be okay. I promise." Lily watched her mother's face for a long moment, searching it the way children search for truth in the eyes of adults. Then she nodded slowly, returned to washing her hair, and said nothing else. By 8 o'clock, both children were in bed in the small room they shared, tucked under a quilt that Mia's mother had made from old t-shirts, each square a memory of someone's life before it fell apart. She pulled the quilt up to their chins. Lily was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. Marcus lay awake, his eyes open in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. "Close your eyes, sweetheart," Mia whispered. "Will you be here when I wake up?" "Always. I will always be here." She sat on the edge of the bed until his breathing changed, until his eyes finally closed and his body relaxed into sleep. Then she stood, moved to the kitchen, and pulled on her work jacket, a thin thing that had been navy blue once but was now a color that had no name. The Meridian Hotel called at 9 in the evening. The graveyard shift started at 10. The hotel occupied a full block in downtown Boston, 40 stories of gleaming glass that caught the October moonlight and threw it back at the sky. When Mia arrived at the service entrance, the night was fully dark, the kind of dark that comes to a city in autumn, the kind that makes you feel like the world has already ended and you're the only one who didn't notice. She clocked in at 9:51 and was assigned to the grand ballroom on the 20th floor, which meant the elevator ride up felt like ascending into another world. When the doors opened, the ballroom spread before her like a cathedral of excess. Chandeliers hung from a ceiling 3 stories high. The floor was Italian marble in black and white, a checkerboard pattern that stretched out endlessly. Crystal vases held white orchids that cost more than Mia made in a week. A private party had ended 2 hours earlier, and the mess that remained was the kind only the wealthy could afford to make. She was given a mop, a bucket, industrial cleaning solution that smelled like something between perfume and poison, and the list of what needed to be done by 6 in the morning. 12 hours to transform the ballroom from looking like it had been lived in back to looking like it had never been touched by human hands at all. At 11:30, she found a $20 bill on the floor near one of the tables. Someone had dropped it, or left it as a tip, or lost it. She didn't know which, and it didn't matter. She pocketed it. By 1 in the morning, she had worked for 3 hours straight without stopping, and the bill was still in her pocket like a small miracle. $20. With the 5 from before, that made 25. Maybe she could get real butter instead of margarine this week. Maybe Marcus could have new socks that weren't borrowed from the donation bin. At 1:02, Douglas Hale appeared. Douglas Hale was the night manager, a man in his early 50s with thick shoulders that strained against his suit jacket and a face that had been handsome once, before cruelty had started carving it up from the inside. His hair was slicked back with something that made it shine, and his cologne arrived in the room before he did, a choking floral smell like someone had dipped a rag in a department store and used it to wipe down a corpse. He watched her mop in silence for a moment. Then he walked over to the cleaning cart where she had rested, took the $20 bill from the small white plate where she had placed it, and slipped it into his own pocket. "You didn't see that," he said, his voice the texture of gravel. Mia's hands froze on the mop handle. She opened her mouth. The words were there, right at the surface, a defense forming. But that's when Cordelia Blackwood emerged from behind one of the orchid arrangements like she had been waiting there the entire time, which she probably had. Cordelia was the evening supervisor, a woman in her late 40s who wore tailored suits that cost more than Mia made in a month. Her heels were always at least 3 inches high, always black, always clicking against the marble in a rhythm that meant someone was coming, something was about to happen, something you needed to prepare for. Her face was sharp, the kind of sharp that suggested she had been beautiful once but had traded beauty for something colder and more useful. She looked at Mia the way a surgeon looks at a patient she's about to cut into. "Mia," Cordelia said, and the way she said the name, with a smile that had no warmth in it, a smile like broken glass, made Mia's stomach clench. "I need you to understand something very clearly. If you have any thoughts about reporting what you just saw, or what you just didn't see, or anything else that happens in this hotel, I would think very carefully about that decision." Cordelia moved closer. Her perfume was different from Douglas's, more expensive, something with notes of jasmine and threat. "Because if you say anything, if even a whisper of a complaint lands on anyone's desk, I can make a phone call. Just one. And I can tell them that you've been stealing. Tips, supplies, maybe a guest's designer watch that went missing last month. You know what happens then? You get arrested. You lose your license to work in hospitality. And more importantly, your children go into the system. Foster care. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" Mia nodded. The mop handle was slick in her hands. "Good," Cordelia said. "Then I think we understand each other perfectly. Now, this ballroom should be spotless by 6. And Mia? Be grateful you have any job at all." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking out a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Douglas followed her, but not before catching Mia's eye and holding it just long enough for her to understand that what had just happened had a purpose, and that purpose was to make sure she knew exactly how little power she had in this world. He wanted her to feel it. The powerlessness. The helplessness. The knowledge that she could work 14 hours a day for the rest of her life and still lose everything. Mia turned back to the ballroom. The chandeliers glittered above her like they were laughing. She went back to mopping. The floor stretched out endlessly, black and white, a pattern that went on forever, and she moved across it with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose body had learned to work even when the spirit had started to shut down. At 3:17 in the morning, the wind outside the hotel windows began to howl. It came up from the harbor, a cold thing that carried the salt of the Atlantic and the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen but was coming. Mia could hear it even from inside, even through the 40 stories of glass and steel. It sounded like something being tortured. Something that knew it was going to lose and was screaming anyway. She finished the ballroom at 5:52 and clocked out at 6:03, which meant no overtime pay because overtime didn't start until 6:05. The walk to the bus stop was 3 blocks, and the wind that had been howling in the early morning hours was now a steady, vicious thing that cut through her thin jacket like she wasn't even wearing it. The city was just beginning to wake. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A few early workers hurried toward their own jobs, their own impossible lives, their own balancing acts between rent and food and staying alive. Mia rode the bus back to Wickham Street, and when she arrived, the apartment was still dark. Both children were still sleeping. She had maybe 4 hours before Lily needed to leave for school, for hours where she could rest, but her mind wouldn't stop working. It kept running the numbers. 85,000. Divided by 14 days. That was over 6,000 a day. Her current salary, if she worked every single day without missing once, would give her maybe 3,000 a month, maybe 4 if she picked up extra shifts. She had already picked up every extra shift available. There was nothing left to cut, no other way to make the numbers work. She sat at the kitchen table in the darkness and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, that she was going to lose the house. The house her grandmother had left her. The only safe place her children had ever known. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Mia was at St. Catherine's shelter, where she volunteered 3 days a week. It was the only place that made her feel like something other than a failure, the only place where her presence seemed to matter. The shelter was in a converted brownstone that had been grand once, decades ago, when the neighborhood had money. Now the walls were painted a hopeful yellow that somehow made everything sadder, and the windows looked out onto a street where people sat on corners with cardboard signs asking for spare change. She was in the children's room, reading to a small group of kids, when she first noticed Emma. The children's room at St. Catherine's shelter was painted a hopeful yellow that somehow made everything sadder. Afternoon light filtered through windows that looked onto a street where people sat on corners with cardboard signs asking for spare change. Mia sat on the floor with her legs crossed, a picture book open in her lap, reading to a small cluster of children whose attention spans kept drifting toward the window. That was when she first noticed Emma. The girl was 7 years old but looked smaller, as if hardship had compressed her into herself. She sat alone on a donated couch in the corner, her small frame swallowed by cushions that had seen better years. Her dark hair was matted in places, her skin pale as bone, and in her trembling hand she held something worn and fragile. A prayer card. The edges were soft from handling, the image faded to almost nothing, the silhouette of St. Michael, wings spread, blade raised against darkness. Mia's eyes caught the detail because children at the shelter rarely held anything precious. They held nothing. They owned nothing. Everything they touched belonged to the state. Emma's eyes were fixed on the card like it was the last piece of her that mattered. Mia finished the story to the other children and watched them scatter toward the toys in the corner, their attention already broken. She stood slowly and moved across the room, her knees clicking slightly from kneeling. Emma did not look up. "That's a beautiful card," Mia said, settling onto the couch beside her. "Not too close." Children at the shelter flinched from sudden closeness. "Do you like stories about angels?" Emma's head turned. Her eyes were hollow in a way that made Mia's chest tighten. The girl opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not a whisper. Not even a breath. Just silence. "That's okay," Mia said quietly. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Emma's eyes dropped back to the prayer card. Her fingers traced the edges where the image was worn away to white. Then her voice came, so quiet that Mia had to lean forward to hear it. "He used to say this prayer before bed." The words were barely there, like a candle flame in wind. Mia waited. Children at the shelter rarely spoke about before. Before was too painful. Before was a door they had learned not to open. My father, Emma whispered. He would hold this and say the prayer. Every night. Even when he was afraid. Mia looked at the card again, really looked. On the back, in faded ink, a name had been written in careful script. Giovanni. The letters had worn slightly from handling, as if small fingers, or larger ones, had traced them hundreds of times. Do you remember the prayer? Mia asked. Emma's head shook. A cough escaped her chest, deep and rattling, the kind of cough that came from lungs that hadn't been treated properly. Mia's hand moved instinctively to the girl's back, feeling the small bones beneath thin fabric. When the cough subsided, Emma looked up at Mia with eyes that had seen too much loss. He left it for me, Emma said. Before he disappeared. The shelter director, a woman named Carol who had worked there for 12 years, found Mia in the storage room an hour later, organizing donated blankets that still smelled of dryer sheets and hope. That's Emma, Carol said without preamble. Found wandering 2 years ago on Huntington Avenue. No identification, no family that came forward, no records of who she was or where she came from. Just this little girl and that prayer card she won't let anyone touch. Does she have a name? A last name? Carol shook her head. We tried to trace it. The name on the card is Giovanni, and Emma says it's her father's name, but there's nothing in any system. We have no one to contact, no lead to follow. She's been in 3 foster homes and ran away from all of them. Now we just let her stay here during the day. Mia's mind was already moving, already asking questions. That night, during her break from the Meridian Hotel, she took the bus to the Boston Public Library downtown. The library closed at 9, but she had 35 minutes. She sat at one of the public computers and typed the name into the search engine. Giovanni Calabrese. Boston. Father. Articles appeared like ghosts surfacing from dark water. The Boston Globe, 2019, suspected organized crime figure linked to East Boston connections. Another article, older, federal investigation into Calabrese family operations continues. Then, 5 years ago, a headline that made her freeze, Calabrese heir blinded in apparent kidnapping attack, brother suspected in assault. The photo showed a man being led from a hospital, dark glasses shielding his eyes, his hand gripping the arm of someone in a suit. The caption identified him as Giovanni Calabrese, 38 years old, victim of an attack that had left him permanently blind. Suspected involvement by his brother Marco. No charges filed. Case closed. Mia stared at the screen. The same name. The same man who had disappeared from a 7-year-old girl's life 2 years ago. A man with a daughter. A daughter who still held his prayer card and whispered his name in the dark. The library's closing announcement came over the speakers. Mia logged out of the computer and walked back toward the bus stop, her mind running in circles. What did it mean? What had happened to this man? What had happened to his daughter? 3 blocks away, at the Meridian Hotel, Douglas Hale was waiting. She found him in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, blocking the doorway so she couldn't pass. Douglas was 47, with a kind of face that looked perpetually angry, thin lips, eyes that never held warmth, hands that always seemed to be reaching. He managed the night shift, and in the 3 years Mia had worked there, he had made it clear that her employment depended entirely on his goodwill. I need you on a double tonight, he said. No greeting. No question. Just a demand hanging in the stale air between mops and bottles of ammonia. I'm already scheduled until 3. Now you're scheduled until 7. He moved closer, and Mia could smell cigarettes and cologne on him. You need this job, don't you? The tips. The paycheck. All of it. I wonder what would happen if you didn't have this job. Mia's hands clenched around the handle of the mop she was holding. She said nothing. That's what I thought. Douglas smiled, and there was nothing friendly in it. 7 in the morning. And smile while you work. The guests like pretty maids. He turned to leave, then stopped. Cordelia Blackwood stood in the hallway, watching. She was the shift supervisor, immaculate as always in her pressed uniform, her dark hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull her face upward. Her smile was sharp enough to cut. "Douglas is very generous to keep you on, Mia," Cordelia said, her voice like honey with poison underneath. "Some people might say you owe him. Some people might wonder what a woman in your situation would do to keep a job. What compromises she might make." She tilted her head. "I'd hate for child services to hear any stories. You never know what might trigger an investigation." The threat landed exactly where it was aimed. Mia's breathing shallowed. "I'll work the double," Mia said. That night, after the double shift ended at 7 in the morning, Mia came home to find her children still sleeping. She sat at the kitchen table in the weak dawnlight and counted her money again. The same $78 in crumpled bills, now even more worn from being counted so many times. The foreclosure notice sat on the table like a curse. 14 days had been 13. 13 had become 12. Now there were 10 days left before the bank took everything. 10 days to find $85,000. She was no one. Nobody. Just a night shift made with crumpled bills and a prayer card that didn't belong to her, hidden in her pocket like a secret. But what she didn't know was that in 48 hours, everything she understood about her own smallness would collapse entirely. The October wind cut through the abandoned street like a blade wrapped in ice. Mia Reynolds stood on the front steps of her house in the pre-dawn darkness, holding a white envelope from the Department of Children and Families. Her hand shook so badly she could barely read the words. "Investigation pending. Parental fitness assessment required. Contact within 48 hours. Dead leaves skittered across the concrete at her feet. She was still wearing her work clothes from the Meridian Hotel, still smelling of bleach and floor wax. The sky above was slate gray, pressing down on her like a coffin lid closing. Inside the house, Lily and Marcus slept. They did not know yet. They did not know that their mother was crumbling on the front steps like ancient stone. She had done it. 2 months ago, she had nothing. Now the house was saved. The foreclosure notice was gone. Giovanni Calabrese had paid the $85,000 without hesitation, had never asked for repayment, had only told her that debts between family were meaningless. She had felt, for the first time in years, like the ground beneath her feet was solid. But Douglas Hale had other plans. 1 week earlier, he had found her in the kitchen of the Meridian Hotel at 3 in the morning. His face was the color of old bruises. He had learned, somehow, that she was connected to Giovanni Calabrese. Not how. Not why. Just that she was. And in the underworld whisper network of Boston, that single fact was enough to destroy her. "You're laundering for the mob," he had said flatly. Not a question. An accusation that would become a weapon. He had spread the rumor carefully, methodically, like poison seeping into water. He told the hotel manager that Mia had suddenly come into money, exactly the kind of money that organized crime uses to hide cash through small businesses. He told other staff members that she was involved, that staying friendly with her could get them all in trouble with the feds. By the end of that week, Mia had been fired. The hotel manager had not looked her in the eye. "We have to think about our liability," he had said. But that was not the blade that cut deepest. Cordelia Blackwood had made the anonymous call to Child Protective Services. Mia knew this the way she knew certain truths without proof, the way she could feel rain coming before the sky changed. Cordelia had called with a story about how Mia was exposing her children to dangerous people, how she was possibly involved in criminal enterprises, how the children might be at risk. The CPS notice had arrived yesterday morning. And now, at 5 in the morning in October cold, Mia stood on her front steps and understood what it meant to lose everything twice. The house was saved. The money was real. But her children could be taken anyway. Everything could end anyway. The people who wanted to hurt her had found a way that the law would approve of. She stood there, shaking. The wind cut through her thin coat. Her breath came in visible clouds. She thought about disappearing. She thought about walking to the bus station and buying a ticket to somewhere else, leaving her children with people who could give them a normal life, a life not tangled up in mafia families and false accusations. She thought about how everyone would be better off without her dragging them down. She turned toward the street. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. No destination in mind, just an exit. Just a way to stop hurting the people who loved her. Then she felt something shift in her coat pocket. The prayer card. Emma's worn prayer card that Emma had pressed into her hand weeks ago with trembling fingers. Emma, who had whispered that her father had held this same card, and maybe if Mia kept it safe it would keep them both safe somehow. Mia pulled it out. The light from the street lamp caught the edges. The card was fragile, the corner bent, the edges soft from being touched by small hands again and again. And in the dim light, she could see the name still sewn into the lining in careful stitching. Giovanni Calabrese. She stood in the middle of the empty street, holding that small fragile thing, and she stopped walking away. She turned around and walked back to the house. Giovanni was in his study when she arrived at 6 in the morning. His eyes were directed toward the window, but she understood now that he saw differently than other people. He saw through texture and echo and the weight of air. He turned toward her before she spoke. "Tell me," he said. His voice was granite. Stone. The voice of a man whose patience was infinite but whose rage was not. She told him everything. Douglas Hale stealing her tips for months. Cordelia Blackwood's threats about Child Protective Services. The fired accusation. The anonymous call. The white envelope in her hand. She told him how she was going to lose her children anyway, that the house meant nothing if Lily and Marcus were taken from her. Giovanni did not move. He did not ask questions. When she finished speaking, there was a long silence that filled the room like water. "Names," he said finally. "Douglas Hale. Cordelia Blackwood." Giovanni nodded once. "Go home. Keep the children with you. Do not let them out of your sight." He reached for his phone. She heard him speak 2 sentences. Douglas Hale at the Meridian Hotel. Cordelia Blackwood, residential address on Beacon Hill. Nothing more. Nothing that sounded like a command. Just information offered, accepted, and understood to be final. The FBI raid at the Meridian Hotel happened at 5 in the morning, exactly 12 hours later. 12 agents in black tactical gear moved through the corridors like ghosts, like men who had done this 1,000 times before. They moved without sound, without wasted motion, each step measured and purposeful. Douglas Hale was in his office, already there because his conscience did not permit him to sleep. They took him without resistance. His hands trembled as they cuffed him. His face was the color of wet clay. The agents found evidence scattered across his desk like breadcrumbs leading back decades. Stolen wages meticulously documented. Embezzlement records. Payoffs to low-level cops. Connections to a 40-person racketeering operation that reached from the Boston waterfront into 3 states. The hotel was a laundry. Money in, cleaned, money out, and staff like Mia and 100 others before her were just vectors for the scheme. Douglas Hale collapsed to his knees as they led him toward the door. He was trembling like a cornered animal, like a thing that had been hunted and finally cornered. "Please," he kept saying. "Please, I didn't know. I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything." The agents ignored him. They led him out in handcuffs as news cameras flashed in the early morning light. By the time the sun rose, his face was on every Boston news channel. At the same moment, exactly timed, FBI agents were making entry into a penthouse apartment on Beacon Hill. Cordelia Blackwood answered the door in a silk robe, her hair down for the first time, her face bare of the perfect makeup that had always been her armor. She understood immediately what was happening. Her composure did not shatter so much as evaporate. The agents found documents in her home that proved she had orchestrated the false CPS reports. Not just against Mia. Against 17 other hotel employees over 8 years. A pattern of control. She would identify vulnerable women, single mothers, undocumented workers, people with debt, and then she would deploy the threat of family court investigations to keep them compliant, afraid, broken. She was led out in handcuffs, still in her silk robe, past neighbors who watched from doorways with expressions of shock and recognition. They had known her, had seen her at the symphony, had assumed she was safe. The news anchor spent hours reporting the story. Federal charges. Racketeering. Embezzlement. Conspiracy. If convicted, each defendant faced up to 40 years in federal prison. 40 years. Giovanni watched the broadcast from his study. Enzo and Pietro stood beside him, their shoulders slightly lower than usual, their faces deliberately neutral. Giovanni did not speak for a long time. "Not death," he said finally, his voice like wind moving across stones. "Too quick. Too easy. Too merciful. Let them rot in a cage for decades thinking about what they took from people like her. Let them think about how they tried to destroy a woman who had nothing, and how that single woman brought everything down on top of them. That is a sentence worth serving." Mia watched the same broadcast from Giovanni's library. Emma was asleep against her shoulder, finally peaceful. Lily and Marcus were asleep on the other side of the room, their small bodies curled against each other. She did not feel triumph. She felt exhausted. She felt relief, and underneath the relief, something she could not name yet. The CPS case was dismissed within 24 hours once the investigation revealed that Cordelia's accusations were part of a larger pattern of false reporting designed to control employees. The social worker called Mia personally to apologize. The word had already spread through the agency. Everyone understood now that these cases were fraudulent. That night, Mia held her children on the couch while all three of them cried, not from sadness, but from the release of holding tension for so long that the body forgot how to do anything else. Lily asked why they were crying when nothing bad was happening. Mia could not explain. She only held them closer. In his study, Giovanni stood by the window. He had asked for the lights to be turned off so he could feel the night air. Enzo approached carefully. "It is handled," Enzo said quietly. "Both of them will be in federal custody within the week. The evidence is overwhelming." Giovanni nodded slowly. "She saved you," Enzo said carefully. "That woman. Emma would have died without her. The house would have fallen anyway. She brought you back from the darkness." "Yes," Giovanni said. "She did." Enzo waited. In 15 years of working for this man, he had learned that silence sometimes meant thinking. Sometimes it meant something else entirely. "Bring the car tomorrow morning," Giovanni said finally. "Early. Before the children wake." Enzo exchanged a look with Pietro that neither of them could explain. Something had shifted in the air. Something that neither of them had seen in 15 years. The oldest, coldest, most ruthless man in Boston had looked at a woman with nothing, and somehow, she had given him something worth more than everything he owned. What would happen next, neither of them could predict. But they understood, in the way men understand these things without words, that Giovanni Calabrese had decided something irreversible. And everything that came after would change because of that single, quiet decision. 1 year had passed. 12 months of October returning in cycles, the same dry Boston wind that had torn through her poverty now swept across a different landscape entirely. Mia Reynolds stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of a penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor, watching the city lights ignite one by one as dusk collapsed into darkness. This was her penthouse. Earned. Legitimate. Real. She wore a tailored charcoal coat, the kind that cost more than 3 months of her old salary. Her dark hair, once pulled back in exhausted knots, now fell in waves past her shoulders. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman she barely recognized, confident, poised, no longer hollowed out by the weight of survival. Behind those eyes that had once counted crumpled bills in a coat pocket now lived someone who had rebuilt everything from the ruins of $78 and pure determination. Lily and Marcus thrived in their private school now, their uniforms crisp, their laughter genuine, their bellies always full. Emma lived in the Calabrese mansion with Giovanni but visited Mia twice a week. The two girls curled together like sisters, whispering secrets in the darkness. The child who had once clutched a prayer card with hollow eyes now sang in the kitchen while someone made her breakfast. Mia pressed her palm against the cold glass. Her breath fogged the window, then cleared. She thought about the woman who had stood in shelters counting coins, who had scrubbed hotel floors while managers stole her dignity along with her tips, who had believed herself invisible to the world. That woman felt like a stranger now. Like a photograph from someone else's life. The door opened behind her. She knew without turning who it was. She had learned his footsteps over the past year, the deliberate pace, the way each step carried the weight of a man accustomed to moving through rooms and having them part for him. Giovanni approached slowly, his dark glasses reflecting the city's glow, a cashmere coat draped across his broad shoulders. At the window, he stopped beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body against the cold glass. Outside, the wind howled like something caged and desperate. "You're thinking too loud," Giovanni said, and there was something like warmth in his voice now, a quality that had not existed a year ago. His men had noticed it first. Enzo had mentioned it to Pietro one evening, in the tone of someone describing a miracle they did not fully understand. In 15 years, I have never heard him make a joke. Now he smiles when she walks into a room. Mia turned her head slightly. Just remembering. They stood in silence. The city breathed below them. Car horns echoed from distant streets. A siren wailed somewhere in the darkness. Giovanni's hand found the window frame, his fingers tracing the edge where glass met metal. "That night you brought Emma to my door," he began, and his voice carried the weight of something he had been carrying for months. "I told myself I was grateful. That is all it was. Gratitude for a man who had saved a man's daughter." He paused. His jaw tightened. But gratitude does not keep a man awake at 3 in the morning listening to the silence. Gratitude does not make him memorize the exact sound of one woman's breathing in a room of hundreds. Mia's breath caught. She did not move. "I trusted no one after my brother sold me to enemies," Giovanni continued, his voice low and solid like an oath. "I built walls so high that no one could reach me. I built an empire so vast that I believed I would never need anything human again. Then you walked through my door covered in cleaning solution and desperation, carrying my dying daughter, and you did not ask for permission. You did not negotiate terms. You simply acted." He turned toward her now, his sightless eye somehow seeing everything. "You were never my debtor, Mia. You were never my employee or my obligation. You were the woman who taught me that family is not always bound by blood but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives." Her hand rose to her mouth. Tears spilled across her cheeks, salt and warmth in the cold penthouse air. She had felt the same pull all year, the same impossible gravity that drew her toward him in crowded rooms, that made her listen for his voice, that made her heart accelerate when their hands accidentally touched over dinner. She had convinced herself it was gratitude, or obligation, or the natural bond that formed between people who had suffered together. But the truth had been hiding underneath all that time, waiting for him to speak it aloud. "I stayed because I wanted to," she whispered, and her voice trembled like a candle in the wind. "Not because of money or safety or because I owed you anything. Because you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You looked at a woman with nothing and saw something worth saving." Their hands found each other in the space between them. Their fingers interlaced. The moment stretched vulnerable and profound, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the breath held before a confession changes everything. Outside, the October wind tore through the Boston streets. Dead leaves scattered across the pavement 42 stories below. Somewhere in the city, life continued its indifferent march. But here, in this penthouse suspended above it all, something irreversible had shifted. Giovanni's thumb traced the back of her hand. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since the night you arrived covered in rain and fury, refusing to let my daughter die while my men stood frozen. I have loved you every day since, and I will love you every day that comes after." Mia stepped closer. Her other hand found his chest, felt the steady beating of his heart beneath the expensive fabric. "I love you too," she said. I was terrified of it. I was terrified that I was only staying because I was afraid of going back to nothing. But I know now that I stayed because you became everything. He lifted his free hand and found her face. His fingers traced her cheek line with extraordinary gentleness, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. Then he leaned down and kissed her, and the kiss tasted like the end of a very long war, like the moment when a caged animal finally understands that the door has been opened and it is safe to walk through. Behind the scenes, in the mansion across the city, Enzo and Pietro were already planning a wedding. No date yet, but it was coming. Marco had already begun making calls to a jeweler who dealt in diamonds the size of a woman's dreams. Giovanni Calabrese, the man who had not smiled in 15 years, was getting married. The entire underworld would hear about it before the week was done. But that was later. Now, in this moment, there was only Mia and Giovanni, and the lights of Boston spread below them like fallen stars. There was only the quiet knowledge that she had come into his life as invisible and desperate as a ghost, and she was leaving it as the woman he trusted most. The only woman he had ever trusted. The only person who mattered. 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon in the Calabrese mansion library, they sat together. Not married yet, but building something that felt far more solid than any legal arrangement could create. Mia, Giovanni, Emma, Lily, and Marcus occupied the leather chairs and the couch, the afternoon light streaming through tall windows and landing in warm patches on the floor. Emma read aloud from a book of children's stories, her voice clear and strong and nothing like the broken whisper it had been a year ago. Her sisters listened, their bodies relaxed, their faces peaceful. Giovanni's hand rested on Mia's shoulder, a gesture so simple and so revolutionary that it made everyone who saw it understand something fundamental had changed in the structure of this house. On the mantel sat the worn prayer card, framed now in glass. The edges were still soft from being held so many times. The name sewn into the lining, Giovanni Calabrese, was still barely visible, a thread connecting past to present, a child to her father, a desperate woman to a blind man who had learned to see. Douglas Hale sat in a federal prison cell in Massachusetts, 18 months into a 40-year sentence. His appeals had been denied. His name had become synonymous with corruption. Former clients had come forward, one after another, each one describing the same predatory behavior, the same theft, the same casual cruelty. The news had stopped covering his case months ago because there was nothing left to report. Cordelia Blackwood's mansion had been seized. Her social standing, once untouchable, had been dismantled piece by piece as her role in the racketeering scheme was exposed. She served time in the same facility as Douglas, their faces occasionally passing each other in hallways, neither one capable of meeting the other's eyes. They had believed themselves invisible and untouchable. They had believed that people like Mia Reynolds were disposable. They had been spectacularly, publicly, definitively wrong. Mia looked around the library at this family she had built, not through blood but through choice and courage and showing up when everyone else had frozen. Emma turned a page. Lily asked a question about the story. Marcus leaned against Giovanni's other side. The blind man who had trusted no one now sat surrounded by the people he loved most, his hand on the woman who had taught him that trust was possible. Sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is not violence or revenge, but simply refusing to abandon the people who need you. Trust is not given to the loudest voice or the most powerful person in the room. It is earned by those who act when everyone else stands frozen in fear. Giovanni Calabrese learned that family is not always bound by blood but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. And Mia Reynolds learned that she was never nobody. She was the woman who saved a child, who earned a blind man's trust, who took $78 and sheer determination and built a life that would not break. If this story moved your heart, do not just watch and leave. Drop a like right now. Your support means everything. Subscribe because tomorrow we are bringing you another story that will change how you see the world. Comment below and tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who later realized your worth? Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by their bank account or their job title. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. No matter how hard life gets, remember that after the rain, the sky clears. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We will see you again in the next video. Goodbye.